Hello, class. Welcome to week 7, or let's see, actually, lecture 7, week 8 of REL 155, early and medieval church history. So, hope you had a nice vacation. Um, and we'll be picking up now where we left off. So, we have, just to remind you, we have today's lecture and one more lecture next week. And then there will be the final exam. So, hopefully, you'll be ready for that. Keep in mind also the assignments. And if you're behind on the assignments, please go ahead and get those to me as soon as you can. Remember, those are necessary for your attendance. And if you, uh, for any assignments you have not turned in for me, you do not get credit for attendance for that week. So um, please go ahead and send me any assignments you're missing, and I'll still accept them, even the ones back from as far as the first week if you have not done those yet. Also, just to remind you, you should be, for each assignment, you should be picking material that is related to what you learned that week. So don't just write something in general about early and medieval church history, but be sure that it relates to the specific week's topic. So don't write something about the first century for this week, because now we're well into the Middle Ages. Be sure that your response does cover what we've covered. And again, I prefer that you not just copy and paste word for word what I've covered in the lesson. I don't just cover my words word for word. Don't just copy like a page or so. That's not what I'm looking for. I would rather you just take one short paragraph to answer something like, I learned such and such this week. I learned about um, this for this topic. You can just summarize. You don't have to go into a lot of detail, and I'm not looking for you to cover everything per se, but just to see that you did learn something. You did watch the lecture, and you did learn something from the lecture. All right. So we will, and keep in mind also the paper is due by the end of the week, and be sure that you get that to me. If you have any questions, again, please ask me, and I'll respond as soon as I can. So let's go ahead and get started with the lecture for this week. Okay, so we are now covering, in our lecture 7, we are now covering chapter 20 of the book, which is called Lifted in a Mystic Manner, and it's about the papacy and the crusader. Again, the papacy refers to the office of the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, and we see um, how important and how powerful this office became during that time. And then obviously this chapter is going to refer to the Crusades that happened in the Middle Ages, the European Christians that fought against the Muslims in the Holy Land. This is a very controversial topic, a very sad aspect of history for Christians, something that we are embarrassed about, but it is a fact that must be considered as well. So let's continue with that. In Paris stands the Gothic Cathedral of Notre Dame, dedicated to the glory of God and the honor of Our Lady, meaning the Virgin Mary, or the Mother of Jesus. This well-known sanctuary reflects a fascinating image of the life and spirit of the Christian Middle Ages. Notre Dame was constructed between 1162 and 1235, some of the most significant years of Western Christianity. While workers were constructing its elaborate details, students exchanged reports of Crusader victories in the Holy Land or debated theological virtues. Some of these students would soon become bishops, and one would carry the papal office to the peak of worldly power as Pope Innocent III. Notre Dame was only one example of the vigorous church building occurring in Europe between 1170 and 1270. More than 500 great churches were built, and Gothic style in France alone. The Gothic style of architecture first appeared in the restoration of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis near Paris. The abbot, whose name was Suger, conceived the project and guided the work of rebuilding. Afterwards, he described the work of reconstruction as being so grand that it essentially stood between heaven and earth. And he claimed to feel himself lifted in a mystic manner from the lower realm to the upper realm. Obviously, this is a metaphor. This is not something that literally happened, but this just inspired him with such awe that he felt, in a spiritual sense, that he was lifted between heaven and earth. The Middle Ages were not all dark, despite our designation of the era as the Dark Ages. No age has aspired for greatness quite like the High Middle Ages or the later periods. Maybe I'm not sure the exact dates of the High Middle Ages, but maybe 1000 to 1500, or the later period, maybe even 1200 to 1500. All right, let's turn to Thy Kingdom Come. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy led an admirable attempt to develop a perfect society on earth. The church achieved an incomparable power and majesty. However, like the Gothic cathedrals, over time it deteriorated. With the church buildings, early Gothic builders tried to reach as high as possible with the materials available. For example, the equivalent of a 30-story skyscraper seen in the Cathedral of Chartres, or 40 stories of the Strasbourg Cathedral. Yet, many such efforts resulted in repeated failures in church construction. By reaching the highest height possible, the architect tried to create the illusion of soaring. The use of flying buttresses or supports eliminated the massive walls of earlier churches and made possible slender pillars carved in the form of still more slender shafts reaching upward toward heaven. This can be seen as an image that describes Western Christianity in the 12th and 13th centuries. The papacy ascended high above European society, resting upon the fading glory of the empire. The emergence of unified national states greatly reduced the power of the empire. Emperors became merely the sovereigns of the cluster of kingdoms and republics that constituted the Germany of the late Middle Ages. In contrast, the papacy built on the forms of Pope Gregory VII and emerged as the most powerful office in Europe. The Pope's government was a truly universal monarchy, as it became completely centralized. In the hands of a strong leader, the papacy could overshadow all secular monarchs. Pope Innocent III proved such a strong leader, a new type of administrator pope. Innocent and other great popes of the era were experts in church government. Innocent declared that Peter, and by extension the papal office, was the vicar or minister of Christ and a mediator between God and humanity. He told the princes of Europe that the papacy was like the sun, while kings were like the moon. Kings derived their powers from the Pope, the way the moon receives its light from the sun. The Pope maintained his authority through spiritual penalties, and almost everyone believed in the Pope's management of the grace that would lead to heaven, and that hell would be the result of losing this grace. Thus, the Pope can use the threat of excommunication, meaning expulsion from the church, as a weapon to bring both peasants and princes under his authority. By the pronouncement of this curse and expulsion from the church, it was believed that people would be deprived of the grace essential for salvation. And while under excommunication, persons could not act as judge, juror, witness, or attorney. They also could not participate in contracts. The Pope also could make use of the interdict, which applied to whole nations, suspending all public worship and withdrawing most of the sacraments from the lands of disobedient rulers. Pope Innocent III successfully applied or threatened the interdict 85 times against uncooperative princes. With such methods, the Pope claimed both earthly as well as spiritual supremacy. Many states even acknowledged him as their feudal lord. For example, after facing the interdict of England, King John became the Pope's vassal, received England back as a fief, and paid an annual tribute to the Pope. And France, Innocent forced King Philip Augustus to comply with the church's moral code by taking back as his queen the woman he had divorced. And within the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany, Innocent intervened in a civil war between rival candidates for the throne and secured the election of the young Hohenstaufen heir, Frederick II, who promised to respect papal rights and go on a crusade. With these devices, which were used as spiritual weapons, Innocent and his successors in the papal office during the 13th century led Christianity to its peak of political and cultural influence. The soaring dreams and delusions of the papacy in this period can be seen especially in the Crusades and in scholasticism. In one, the Pope claimed power over the holy cause in history. In the other, he maintained authority over the souls of men and women, even in eternity. Let's turn now to taking up the cross for Christ. The Crusades reflected the new dynamics of Western Christianity. Islam had come to birth through the visions and revelations claimed by the Prophet Muhammad, who was born in 570. At the age of 40, he began to retire into a cave for extended periods of contemplation and meditation. After one of these occasions, he told his wife that he had been visited by an angel who ordered him to recite. From that, from that command came the Quran, which literally means to recite. While he was initially perplexed, his wife told him this could be the call of God upon him. A handful of family members followed him, while many resisted his claims to be God's spokesman. After various battles and arguments, Muhammad was able to gain a vast following in Arabia. In the first 100 years, numerous capitals such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo fell to Islam. After Muhammad's death in 632, his succession became a divisive issue as a struggle for the leadership of the movement took place. One group, the Sunnis, insisted that the first caliph, or the leader of Islam to succeed Muhammad, be elected. The other group, the Shiites, argued that the successor must come from Muhammad's family and thus should be Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son in law. In the age of the grand cathedrals, crusaders from Western Europe attempted to expel the Muslims from the Holy Land, meaning Palestine. Historians have attributed numerous motives to the crusaders: religious fervor, love of adventure, and dreams of personal profits. Christians also sought to counter Islam's strong military conquest and keep their geographic strongholds from being overrun. By the 8th century, one half of all Christians lived under Islamic rule. For centuries, peaceful pilgrims had been traveling from Europe to worship at the birthplace of Christ, meaning Bethlehem, in Palestine. The rise and spread of Islam in the Near East during the 7th century did not interrupt this traffic. By the 10th century, bishops organized mass pilgrimages, meaning religious journeys, to the Holy Land. During the 11th century, however, Christian pilgrims began to encounter persecution, which became especially severe when the Seljuk Turks, who were fanatical converts to Islam, swept into the Holy Land. Forces from the Eastern Empire tried desperately to bar the invaders, but at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Turks captured the Eastern Emperor and scattered his army. Within a few years, Asia Minor, which was the chief source of Byzantine revenue and troops, was lost, and the emperor was writing to Western princes and to the Pope, seeking mercenaries to aid in the rescue of lost territories. In addition, tales of alleged Turkish mistreatment of Christian pilgrims spread throughout Europe, which incited those in the West against the Muslims. In 1095, after the Eastern Emperor sent out an urgent appeal for help, Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade to regain the Holy Land. Preaching at the Council of Clermont in southeastern France, the Pope urged Christians to take up the cross and strive for a cause that promised both spiritual reward and material gain. As Urban entered his impassioned appeal, a cry of "God wills it" came from the multitude, becoming the battle cry against the Muslim enemy. For 7 centuries, Christians have tried to forget the Crusades, but Jews and Muslims will not allow them to do so. The Crusaders were human beings, so their motives were mixed and often in conflict. The word crusade refers to taking up the cross after the example of Christ, and thus applying Jesus' call to sacrifice to the cause of war. Kind of a definitely misinterpretation or perversion of Jesus' call. The Crusaders were fully aware of the spiritual rewards Urban promised them, including full forgiveness of their past sins. Most of them also had respect for the land that Jesus had walked on. Urban and those who followed him saw the Crusades as a new type of war, a holy war. Though Augustine had laid down principles for a just war, these were all set aside in the excitement of the cause. The purpose of the Crusades changed from liberating fellow Christians to conquest of infidels, meaning non-Christians in this case, in the Holy Land, and the supposedly high calling was believed to excuse acts of brutality, such as disregard for non-combatants and prisoners. The beginning of the Crusades led to horrible attacks against the Jews, and even fellow Christians were not spared from rape and plunder. Crusaders also committed terrible atrocities on their Muslim foes, sawing open dead bodies and sometimes engaging in acts of cannibalism, meaning eating human flesh. Okay, we'll turn to key events of the Crusades. From the end of the 11th century to the the end of the 11th century to the end of the 13th century, Christian Europe, led by the popes, launched 7 major crusades, as well as various small expeditions. The First Crusade was composed of feudal nobles from France, parts of Germany, and southern Italy, where the Norman invaders had settled. The armies proceeded overland to Constantinople and were hastily directed by the emperor out of Constantinople to fight the Turks. The First Crusade was the most successful of the 7. With no more than 5,000 knights and infantry, it overcame the resistance of the Turks, who were no longer united. It captured the city of Jerusalem and a long strip of territory along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and created the feudal kingdom of Jerusalem, which survived until 1291, when its last remnant fell to the Muslims. When the kingdom of Jerusalem faced its first crisis and was near the brink of destruction in 1147, the mystic Bernard of Clairvaux called for the Second Crusade. This crusade achieved nothing and faded away after 2 years. The original excitement had cooled, and signs of corruption of the holy cause were apparent as the popes became more interested in financial gain. In the Middle Ages, it was believed sins had to be confessed in order to be forgiven. Upon hearing a confession, the priest not only pronounced the penitent's guilt forgiven, but also required a penalty as a mark of repentance. Purgatory was claimed to provide an opportunity for penance after death if the person died before, before performing penance. Such penance was called temporal punishment. For years, the church had claimed the power to remit part of this temporal punishment, but no complete remission had been granted until Urban II offered total remission or indulgence for crusaders who headed for Jerusalem. It was only a slight step farther to confer similar benefits upon those who were unable to go on a crusade, but who contributed to the cause. In 1187, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, brought vigorous leadership to the Muslims. When Jerusalem was retaken by the Muslims, Christians responded to the call for the Third Crusade in 1189. Its leaders were three of the most famous medieval kings: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Richard the Lionhearted of England, and Philip Augustus of France. To keep the Muslims united, Saladin proclaimed a jihad or holy war against the Christians. Yet he also was a patient statesman and made a proposal for a settlement. Richard and Saladin finally agreed to a 3-year truce and free access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. The Fourth Crusade revealed the harsh realities of papal ambitions in the East and the degradation of the crusading zeal. Upon becoming Pope in 1198, Innocent III devoted himself to the effort of reviving the crusading spirit, but the few knights who responded were unable to meet the large shipping charges demanded by the Venetians, who persuaded them to capture the Christian town of Zara that had been an ongoing nuisance to Venetian ships to meet these costs. In 1202, the Crusaders sacked Zara. Innocent excommunicated all who participated. The Venetians then pressured the Crusaders to attack Constantinople. The Crusaders ravaged the city and set up the Latin Empire of Constantinople in 1204, forgetting about the deliverance of the Holy Land. Innocent wrote a condemnation of the Crusaders, yet he took advantage of the situation to appoint an archbishop of Constantinople to serve Roman interests. And as you remember, Constantinople was part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, so the Patriarch of Constantinople was uh, belonged to that church, not to the Roman Catholic Church. So here, the Roman Catholic Pope was trying to take advantage of that to spread his own power into this eastern area that's normally not under his power. Uh, the Latin Empire in Constantinople lasted until 1261, But the ancient city never fully recovered. The conquest increased the division between the Greek and Latin churches and hastened the fall of the city in 1453 to the Turks. Other crusaders marched and wandered east during these years, but were unable to stop or postpone the return of the Holy Land to Muslim control. The era of the Crusades ended in 1291 when Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, fell to the Muslims. Let's turn to results of the Holy Cause. The long range results of 2 centuries of crusading zeal are not impressive. The Crusaders failed to win the Holy Land, check the advance of Islam, or heal the division between the Eastern and Western churches. For a time, more kingdoms led by Jerusalem were established along the eastern Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land. In these, the Crusaders created 3 semi monastic military orders: the Templars, meaning Knights of the Temple, with headquarters on the site of the old Jerusalem Temple; the Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, founded to care for the sick and wounded; and the Teutonic Knights, an exclusively German order. These orders had as their aims the protection of all pilgrims and perpetual war against the Muslims. Perhaps the most significant result was the added splendor the Crusades brought to the papacy. Not only did a pope launch the First Crusade, but popes throughout the period were the primary inspiration for fresh expeditions. They, rather than the emperors, strove to unite Christendom against Islam. But like the Gothic architects who built their cathedrals higher until the towers collapsed, the popes tried the impossible. When Christian Europe took Syria and Jerusalem in a fit of enthusiasm, it had no power to retain them. From the mistakes of the Pope, we should remember 2 basic truths. First, Christianity's highest satisfaction is not guaranteed by the possession of special places. Second, the sword is never God's way to extend the church. These faults eventually led to a religious collapse of the structure of Christian Europe. And now we turn to chapter 21, the Nectar of Learning, which is about scholasticism. Scholasticism, as we see, is not just the way we use the term to describe general studying or academics, but it's a special movement of Christian theologians in the Middle Ages, or a special theological movement, as we'll see. For 8 centuries, Gothic cathedrals throughout Europe have inspired worshippers and awed tourists. The medieval masters of Gothic style tried to portray in stone and glass the central religious quest, the tension of people aspiring to reach the heights of heaven as God reached down to the least of them. The movement of the Gothic is two-way. The pillars, arches, and steeples pointed toward heaven, but through colorful windows of leaded glass, the light of God descends to meet the lowly. It is an architect's version of human reason and divine revelation. Windows in the Gothic structure could be plentiful and large because the outside pillars and buttresses eliminated the need for thick walls. Artists used brilliant colors of glass, such as crimson, blue, purple, and ruby, to tell the story of redemption from creation to the Last Judgment. The effect was spectacular. Sunlight shining upon the structure enabled people to sense a kinship with biblical figures and Christian saints of the past, who were often depicted in the glass windows. Light had been a constant symbol of God and his ways with people. The Gothic cathedral displayed the spiritual tension of the Christian drama, the highest aspirations of humanity, and the descending light of God. While this language is figurative, Christians have always described their need in terms of reach and God's truth in terms of descent. Let's turn to the rise of universities. Appropriately, schools in these cathedrals gave birth to medieval universities, for the supreme task of the university was to understand and explain the light of God's revealed truth. The universities revealed an intense hunger to understand the truth of God received from any land. We call this period in the history of Christian thought scholasticism because a distinctive method of scholarship arose and because a unique theology of the Middle Ages emerged. The aim of these teachers, known as schoolmen, was to reconcile Christian doctrine and human reason, as well as to arrange the teachings of the church in an orderly system. It's what we call systematic theology. Since the major doctrines of the church were regarded as fixed, the purpose of discussion was not to search freely for truth, but to show the reasonableness of the doctrines and explain their implications. With intellectual curiosity, the scholastic effort advanced. Medieval education could be described as living religiously in a studious manner. Its central aim was eternal salvation. Originally, learning had been limited to the clergy. Benedictine monks also created a kind of basic schooling for their spiritual development. In the 8th century, Charlemagne widened the opportunities for study through a decree that every monastery have a school to teach all who were able to learn. The best chance for learning for lay people came from cathedral schools. Since cathedrals, meaning churches of the bishops, were located in towns, their schools to train parish priests were in time open to all. The education of the cathedral school was limited to grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the seven liberal arts, which were called such because in ancient Rome their study had been reserved for liberi or freemen. The few texts available were writings of a handful of scholars of the early Middle Ages. Let's look at the magnetism of an able teacher. With the great schoolmasters, a new era began. We can trace the birth of universities to the magnetism of popular teachers whose skill and enthusiasm for learning attracted students. The first of these teachers was Gerbert, master of the cathedral school at Reims in the latter half of the 10th century, who later became Pope Sylvester II. He left a deeper impact on history through his scholarship. After studying mathematics in Spain, Gerbert returned to Reims, deeply impressed by the inquisitive spirit of the Muslim scholarship he had encountered abroad. When he began to teach at Reims, he had his students study Roman classics, and he collected manuscripts to build a significant library, which was especially impressive considering the high cost of manuscripts at the time. The liveliest figure in this early stage of intellectual revolution was Peter Abelard, who lived from 1079 to 1142. The son of a minor noble in Brittany, Abelard gave up his inheritance rights to roam France and learn from the great masters. In time, he established himself as a lecturer in Paris, where he attracted students and began to write. In one writing, he posed 158 questions from Christian teaching and answered them with conflicting quotations from the scriptures, the church fathers, and pagan classics. He valued the role of questioning to lead to the truth. Some were alarmed at his views, and a book he wrote on the Trinity led to his confinement in a monastery. However, He gained the monastery's permission to leave a year later to live in the wilderness south of Paris, where he again drew students to learn from him. He continually fell into disfavor with conservative church leaders and was condemned for heresy at a council in 1140. Abelard then retired to the Abbey of Cluny, remaining in seclusion the last 2 years of his life. No one, however, could stop the spread of his influence. Schools developed all over the continent. Within 100 years of his death, universities flourished at Paris, Orleans, and Montpellier in France, across the English Channel, at Oxford and Cambridge, and at Bologna and Padua in Italy. The grouping of students and masters into guilds was an important characteristic of the flourishing universities. Scholars banded together for mutual interest and protection and called themselves a universitas, the medieval name for any corporate group. In Italy, student guilds, which included mature men pursuing advanced study, came to exercise great power. At French and English universities, where students were younger, masters guilds had more control and even made rules for students. Medieval universities did not have any sort of permanent lodgings. At first, lectures were given in wayside sheds at Oxford and Cambridge, in the cathedral abbeys in Paris, and in the squares in Italy. In time, teachers rented rooms. With no established property, universities could move elsewhere at any time needed. In addition to lectures, the method of teaching was the disputation, in which two or more masters, and occasionally the students, debated text readings, employing Abelard's question and answer approach. Scholasticism developed in this context and came to stand for painstaking arrival at logical conclusions through questioning, examining, and arranging details into a system of logic. Let's turn to support for the papal monarchy. All of this activity occurred under the observation of the papacy. Some debates continued for generations, but the popes worked to make sure that the result was a new philosophical framework that supported the papal monarchy while including a new formulation of church law and a systematic statement of Christian theology. The University of Bologna in Italy emerged in the late 12th century as the center of the study of Roman civil and church or canon law. Canon law served the church just as civil law supported a secular government. It defined the rights, duties, and powers of all people and priests within the church. It was the law administered in all church courts. Okay, stop here for a minute and continue shortly.